Well, welcome everybody. It's really nice to see you all today for today's online IHR History of Education seminar, which again is very much international in nature. I'm delighted today to be able to welcome Dr. Parimala V. Rao from Delhi, a very good friend of the Institute and our research centre. And today she'll be discussing a really fascinating topic based on her own research, colonial state and indigenous schools in 19th century India. So over to you, Parimala.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor McCulloch, for inviting me to share my research. I'm really thankful. Today, I'll be talking about colonial state indigenous schools in the 19th century. Sorry, in the 19th century. I can't move my slides. How do I? Yes, sorry, I could. At the beginning of the 19th century, we find three distinct kinds of schools in India. The first category consists of Sanskrit schools, which were called tols in Eastern India and Pathshalas in rest of India. And we also have Arabic madrasas. These are essentially religious schools. These schools also taught philosophy, Hindu and Islamic philosophy, and the rest of the the tradition in Arabic and Sanskrit. We have second set of schools called Persian schools, which were there mostly in northern India, and we also had the third set of schools, which were vernacular schools. So today I'll be talking about the vernacular schools because they were more numerous than the other schools, and then all sections of the society had access to them. And this is also very fascinating because these vernacular schools were taught in 11 languages and 10 distinct scripts. And most of these languages are not mutually intelligible to each other. So, so there is a wide variety of data we have. And the schools were there in both rural and urban areas. So within this, indigenous vernacular schools, I'll be discussing three important things. Firstly, the nature of vernacular schools, like, who had access to that, who were actually going to school, what was being taught, and then, what was the school timings and how much teacher actually earned their income. And then the second question that I would be addressing is that, was there a monitorial system in these schools? Because monitorial schools were, became very popular in England and Europe later in the beginning of the 19th century. And it is said that, Andrew Bell drew his inspiration from indigenous vernacular schools in India. But let us see if that was the case. And finally, I will address the issue, what did colonial state do to these indigenous schools? This is a very bad map that I could download from the internet because I wanted to show the parts that the British controlled and the parts that was in the hands of Indian kings, Nawabs and kings. So the pink or the purple colored area was British India, and the green colored area was, roughly India had about 560 small and big kings and Nawabs and Nizams, the independent rulers who were ruling. So today I'll be talking about the schools, indigenous schools in British India, because that is where we have the data from. We do not have the data for the, the Indian, these independent kingdoms were called princely states. We don't have data for that. Even when the data was collected, it was collected much later in the early part of 19th century, later part of 19th century or early part of 20th century. So the data was collected anyway, for the British India was collected between 1819 to 1853. The reason for collecting the data was essentially the British Parliament earmarked 100,000 rupees for the promotion of education in India. And this was at the time of passing of the Charter Act of 1813. And the British liberals like Robert Percy Smith and others had fought for this. Robert Percy Smith was Attorney General in Bengal presidency, and he was one of the liberals who wanted to encourage education in India. Now, if to give a small brief background to that, between 1757 to 1857, East India Company, a joint stock company, ruled India. And every 20 years, it had to take permission from the British Parliament, that is to get the Charter Act passed every 20 years to continue to administer India. So at the time of passing of the charter, a number of liberals, when I use the term liberals, I don't mean the people who supported free trade. In Indian context, it was those officers who were interested in social reform, they were interested in economic reform, they opposed oppressive zamindari system in which was implemented in the later part of 18th century. And they were also the people who wanted to include Indians in higher administrative setups. So I use the term liberal in that sense, as opposed to the Tories, as opposed to the conservative governor generals and governors and other officials. So the government did not spend the money because it was, Governor General Hastings, who was again a conservative Governor General, who did not spend the money from 1813 to 1821. And also at the same time, the Orientalists who controlled education at the point of time, they were interested in funding Arabic and Sanskrit colleges and not schools where ordinary common people frequented. So the first education department was established in 1823. It was called General Committee of Public Instruction. And the government proposed to spend this 100,000 rupees on two Sanskrit colleges at Nadia and Tirhut. Nadia is in Bengal and Tirhut is in North Bihar. And at madrasas at Bhagalpur and Jaunpur. Islamic scholars accepted and they demanded one more madrasa at Murshidabad, which was sanctioned. The Sanskrit Pandits refused because according to traditional Hindu belief that one should not trade knowledge for money. So they did not want to take salary from these, in these Sanskrit colleges to teach the knowledge that they had. On the other hand, the British liberals wanted to strengthen vernacular schools where most of the Indians went to these schools, and they wanted to introduce modern subjects to them and then also appoint Indians to higher position. This is a common thread of argument by most of the liberals. Either they are saying vernacular schools should be strengthened. Some of them are saying, yes, that along with that, we should also introduce modern subjects like modern sciences. And all of them are saying that Indians should be appointed to the higher positions in the administration. Thomas Munro, he was a governor of Madras Presidency. Madras is in the southern part of India. He declared in 1818 that India has no political freedom, no voice in framing laws or imposing taxes. So in order to give voice to Indians, Indians should be brought into the higher administration. They were at the lower administration, but then he wanted to bring them into higher administration. And that was possible only by improving the education system. So he ordered a massive survey of indigenous schools. So he wanted to know what exactly was happening there and how they could be improved. So at that point of time, he proposed, establishing 300 primary and 40 secondary schools. Sorry. But then he died pretty early. He died in 1827. So he could establish only 80 primary schools and 20 secondary schools. So Munro also argued at some point of time, these are very radical ideas coming in the early part of 19th century from the British officers. He said that when the Indians are able to form their government, the British control over India should be gradually withdrawn. This is something, he's saying it. He said it in 1824. And he was hated mainly because of, this kind of a radical idea, because conservatives did not want to leave India. I mean, it was a colony. So we have in Western India, I'm bringing examples from all parts of India to give you a larger picture of what was happening across. Francis Warden in Western India, again, he said that government, that 100,000 rupees earmarked by the British Parliament should be spent on schools. And, so that would encourage Indians to, go in for higher education and also, enter the services. This is another interesting argument put forth by Robert Shortreed. Robert Shortreed said that we should establish schools for the masses in rural areas to prevent the peasants from becoming easy prey to the landlords and moneylenders. And then another, officer is actually a judge. He said that, we should enable a peasant to write a letter of business, to draw out bond, to understand the terms of a mortgage, and to cast up his accounts to know if his receipts for rent are correctly signed. So this was generally the argument of the liberals. And it was this set of people who collected the data. So we have 5 sets of data on indigenous schools that are available to us. The first set of data was collected by Thomas Best Jervis in 1819, 1820. British conquered Western India in 1818. So this data was collected within a year of the British conquest. Actually, the government was not interested, they did not pay any attention to education. It was not interested in education. It had just conquered the large areas of Western India. And officers were sent into the interior to collect basic data for establishing the administration, like how many villages, how many men and women, and this basic data. Jervis was a Marathi scholar. He already knew the Marathi language, which was the language of the district, and he was interested in education. In fact, he established the first teacher training institution in India in 1820. So I'm not going there. So he went to the district, and then he went to all the 86 schools that were available, that were working at the point of time. So we have the micro data of the names of all the 86 teachers, their caste and religious status, and the caste-wise list of students from each of these schools. So this is a very rich data. I give more importance to this particular data because this was collected within 1 year of the British administration, so it's virtually untouched by external influences. For example, when Monroe ordered the collection of the data in 1822, British rule was already 60, 70 years old. So there is a possibility that missionary influence or other external influences could have affected these schools. Same is the case with William Adams' data also. So this is a data baseline that we can keep and then compare the rest of India's data with this data. Then we have, Francis Warder, I have already mentioned. He collected the data in 1824-25. And Macaulay wanted to improve rural schools, so he called on William Adam to collect the data in 1835. The entire Bengal, Bihar data was collected between 1835 to 38. Then we have the fifth set of data, which are not very reliable, mainly because H.S. Reed, Henry Stuart Reed, was an Orientalist. He did not want the government to spend money on education. He was completely against government, opening schools or encouraging the existing schools. So, but then he had to collect the data because the data had to be produced before the British Parliament at the time of the renewal of the charter in 1853. Then, but then we have some data, but then not entirely reliable. Then we have data collected by William Arnold for Punjab, and again, Arnold completely dismissed off that Punjab, spoke Punjabi. The people of Punjab spoke Punjabi, and he said that it's just a dialect; it's not even a language. And he imposed Urdu, which is a Persian-based language with a Persian script. And so we don't have, much of a data. He simply says that there are, girls in schools and there are women teachers, but how many of them? Which are the areas that these schools existed? Where are those schools? We have no data from William Arnold. So the existing data from the first 4 categories, we have roughly about 16,000 indigenous schools that can be tabulated, and when there are many schools which cannot be tabulated. For instance, Evan Bailey, the judge of North Konkan, wrote that there were 380 boys in schools in Thana district, but how many schools were there, we do not know. But then he gives some idea that then the students came from Brahmin, that is the topmost of the caste, then the Prabhu, again an upper caste, then Sutar is a carpenter who comes from one of the lower caste, and Bhandari is a toddy tapper who comes from lower than that category. So, and then also even coolies. So we know that students came from various sections of the society as well as from the economically deprived sections. But then without a caste-wise list, it is difficult to tabulate the data. So this is the earliest data of Thomas Best Jervis. So we have 33 teachers from a Brahmin community, which is a topmost, in the caste hierarchy. We have 567 from, Brahmin community. We have the dominant caste. The dominant caste category here consists of both the landed gentry as well as the business community. Then we have the artisanal caste, who come from, they were, children of potters, coppersmith, goldsmith, toddy tapper, oil presser, carpenter, and so on and so forth. We have 2 Muslim teachers and 2 Jewish teachers, and we have 65 Muslim students and 25 Jewish students. And all of them are in Marathi schools. These are not religious schools. These are indigenous vernacular schools. If we go to the further disaggregated data, the micro data which Jervis gives, this data is important to see that, the kind of inclusive classrooms that we see in these schools. We have, one Brahmin, is teaching one Brahmin, a Brahmin teacher is teaching one Brahmin, 6 Sona, that is, Goldsmith caste, and then a host of all other castes, and the school is held in a shed that belonged to an oil presser. In another school, the reason why I give this is that this is the biggest school of the district. And we have children from all sections of this, Hindu society, but also we have 3 Jewish and 7 Muslim boys who are studying Marathi language in the village temple. So to show the inclusive nature of the schools, that I have, put this data together. Then when Francis Warden collected the data about 5 or 6 years later, was there any difference? We don't find much of a difference. We again see, a certain section of Brahmin, students and students are there, and for the rest, we have a very large section from the non-Brahmin community, and then we have, sizable number from the artisanal caste for these districts. The reason why I gave the data for these 2 districts is that the first district, Viragram and Ahmedabad, they are Gujarati speaking districts, and the other 2, Dharwad and Belgaum, they are Kannada speaking districts. These are 2 separate languages, 2 separate scripts, again, not mutually intelligible to each other. This is the large data that we have from Thomas Munro's collection. That is 20 districts data, which is not easily readable. That's why I have put it in a very simple form here. The data is of 11,691 schools, and this comes from 5 distinct, linguistic groups. And again, all the 5 languages have 5 different scripts, and then again, they are not mutually intelligible to one another. But to some extent, Kannada and Telugu, one can understand a bit, and again, Malayalam and Tamil, one can understand a bit, but then they are completely different languages. So again, we have about 30,000 Brahmin students, 13,000 Vaishya. Vaishya is a business community. Then again, a whole host of Shudra caste, we have 75,000 plus, and all other castes, the students coming from lower than the Shudra, that is lowest of the social order, we have around 22,000 students, 142,000 Hindu students, and then we have around 10,864 Muslim students, because Muslims form very small section of the population, around 5%. So we have for Bengal presidency, again, we have 1,470 teachers. And here we have the caste-wise list of teachers we can tabulate, but then for Madras presidency, we don't have the caste-wise list of teachers. We just have the data for students. So this is again, it shows inclusive classroom, both with regard to the teachers and students. And we also have teachers from the untouchable caste, which are very specifically mentioned, which is not there, certainly not there in Western India at all. In Western India, you don't find students from the lowest of the social order, but here you find both teachers and students from the lowest of the order, social order. So we have the list here, different castes of teachers. This is for the teachers, and this is for the students. So we have more or less, inclusive classrooms. So for the Northwestern province, again, the data that H.S. Reid has given, it's only for 8 districts, because British controlled only 8 districts at the point of time. And the rest of the northern India was controlled by the Nawab of Awadh and other smaller, Nawabs. So again, we have 1,039 schools in 50 towns and 1,967 schools in 1,535 villages. And there were no schools in 12,987 villages. So we have the sizable bulk of the villages which did not have schools. And this is something common across India. In other parts, they do not give us the data, how many schools, how many villages did not have schools, but then here we have the data here. So we have, again, a number of castes who are teachers, again, the upper caste are majority, and we have only 6% from the artisanal caste. We have 21,000 Hindu students, and then we have 6,614, were from Brahmins, 10,429 from non-Brahmin upper caste, and 4,299 from the lower caste. We have another 5,491 students from the, from the Muslim community. These are all Hindi and Urdu teaching schools, and they are not, they were not the religious schools like madrasas. So now, till now, I was talking only about boys. Most of India, girls did not have access to schools. Entire Western India, entire Northern India, entire Eastern India, girls were not there in schools. Only in Southern India, girls were there. But then even there, their numbers were very small. We have seen, 142,000 boys were there. In comparison, we have only 3,344 Hindu girls. This is a microscopic minority of girls were there. We have 1,240 Muslim girls in school. So, these languages were very well developed by 18th century. And we also have a, Kannada poet by name Sanchi Honnamma. In fact, interestingly, this Honnamma comes from a very low caste. She's not the lowest, but then she comes from one of the Shudra caste, and she has written a critique of patriarchy in her work titled Habibade Dharma. It has still not been translated into English, and I am trying to do it. It will take a while for the translation to come through. Now, do we see an all India pattern in this data? We do see about 70 to 75%, students and teachers come from non-Brahmin caste, and more than 35% were from artisanal caste. We have the whole host of, caste from where the teachers had emerged. And we also have a peculiarity that in a place, Andhra, it is southern state, but then on the East coast. And then Gujarat, which is on the western side on the, Arabian Sea, the west coast. Majority of teachers were Brahmins. These are the only two provinces where the majority of teachers were from Brahmin community. So one peculiarity which was common across India was that there was no dedicated school buildings. So schools were conducted in temples, sheds, mosques, and houses of rich persons. Sorry, I forgot to give one important information, that is all these schools were single teacher schools. Except a couple of them where two brothers or two relatives together had opened a school. So average number of students per school was anywhere between 8 to 25, and the exception in Konkan there was a school with only 2 boys, and in Kaira town there was a school with 150 students. It was this school which was managed by 2 brothers. Schools worked for 12 hours a day from daybreak to sunset, and there was a break between 9 and 10 a.m. in the morning, and again 2 to 3 p.m. And the officers who have collected the data, they just said that the boys went home for their rice, which means they went home to eat their rice, obviously means meals. The boys in vernacular schools began around, anywhere between 5 to 7 years, and they completed by the time they were 13 or 14. The schools functioned on the basis of lunar month of 27 days, and schools had 4 holidays a month, which was full moon, new moon, Ekadashi, which is the 11th day in the Hindu calendar, and Dwadashi, 12th day in the Hindu calendar. And wherever the Muslim boys were, predominant, Friday was also given as a holiday. And of course, on Hindu and Muslim festivals, these schools were closed. The curriculum is very interesting. The languages, modern Indian languages, whether it was Marathi, Bengali, Kannada, Tamil, or any of the languages, were taught through the translations of epics, Hindu epics, Ramayana or Mahabharata. So, and then both the texts were not taught together, but then it depended upon the popularity in that region. For example, in Andhra Pradesh, where Ramayana was more popular, so Telugu translation of Ramayana was taught. In Karnataka, where Mahabharata was popular, and Kannada translation of Mahabharata was taught. So they also used a text called Amarakosha, which was dictionary come, grammar come, it had everything that would teach a child about the language, roots of the words, gender, etc. Then the third set of books that was used across India was Panchatantra and Hitopadesha. Panchatantra was a 2nd century BC to 3rd century AD. It was composed during that period, and Hitopadesha was composed between 7th and 8th century AD. And both these texts are essentially stories of animals. So these are moral stories told to the children through the stories of animals. For example, in some stories, the king is a lion, and the minister is a jackal, and so on. They are just animal characters. Panchatantra has hardly any human character in them. All the characters are animals, and Hitopadesha has a few human characters, but then rest of them are all animals. They are interesting stories for children essentially. Madras used the text called Tirukural for teaching Tamil. Of course, the teachers used letters, petitions of the locality, whatever they could lay their hands on. So the sum total of what was taught to these children by the time these boys left the school, they were masters in composition, grammar, literature, arithmetic up to long division, multiplication tables, deciphering various handwriting, writing common letters, drawing up forms of agreement. They were masters in these things. The peculiarity with Gujarat was that the rest of India, alphabet was taught first, and then children started writing short, small words and then short sentences. In Gujarat, it was numbers. They were taught to write number 1 to 100, and then multiplication table, and then language was taught. So this was one peculiarity we find in Gujarat. Punishment was severe, caning was common. And then most of the officers who collected the data, they plead with the government to stop this, the severe punishment. Again, the system was that students did not fail. The bright students took about 4 years, average students took about 6 years, and below average students took about 8 years to complete the course of instruction. The students started with Sandboard, writing on the Sandboard. Sandboard is an amount of sand that is put in front of children so that they trace their alphabets and numbers, and then write small words and then sentences, and they would then graduate to wooden boards. In Bengal, plantain leaves were used for practicing arithmetic. And older students used handmade paper. So we have reports of how these wooden boards were made from various places, from North India, South India, and also from Western India. In South India, the soapstones were cut into shape of sticks, and they were used for writing. In North India, the white clay was rolled into the shape of a crayon, and it was used for writing. So the teacher's income differed from place to place, and at that time, 1 rupee had 16 annas, and today we have metric system, so 1 rupee has 100 paisa. So students paid anywhere between 1 to 8 annas, and almost all the officers who collected the data say that every teacher taught few poor students free of cost. They did not charge any fee. And these are the Punjab had both the lowest income in a Talwandi district, 1 rupee 2 annas, and it also had a very high income in Lahore and Kasur, which was 7 rupees 8 annas to 8 rupees 8 annas. South India, it was roughly about 6 to 8 rupees. It was this income that was in a way responsible for the kind of close bond that I'm going to talk about, between the colonial state and the indigenous schools. Again, we find a peculiarity in Gujarat where the teacher did not get, monthly fee. He was given at every stage a child pass. For instance, a child mastered, writing 1 to 100 numbers, then he got 2 rupees. And then after the child mastered the multiplication table, again he got 2 rupees. So this is something very peculiar to Gujarat that did not happen in other parts of India. Now coming to the monitorial system, was there a monitorial system? Well, Andrew Bell stayed in India during 1787 to 1796. And he started a military asylum in Egmore, which is very close to Madras. Now it is a part of Madras right now. And then he experimented with this monitorial system. He has said that he has been inspired by the indigenous vernacular schools. He has seen this in the indigenous vernacular schools, that this mode of instruction that from time immemorial has been practiced by the Hindus. And this is, the concept of, has been the Hindus practicing this from time immemorial is repeated in almost every document that I have seen. Now we have the data collected by 40 officers in Bombay Presidency and 50 in Madras, and William Adams' comprehensive data for Bengal and Bihar. Except one reference, nobody else makes mention of this. So we have Alexander Duncan Campbell, who was a collector in Ballari district, which is not a Tamil speaking area, which is again a Kannada speaking area. So he has just half a sentence he has written in his report, that the lower ones of which are partly under the care of monitors. So what does he mean by partly under the care of monitors? Were monitors actually teaching while the teacher supervised? We do not have any clear idea. In fact, Jervis also mentions that masters sometimes asked an advanced student to help a weaker student to learn his lesson. But at the same time, Jervis suggested adopting Lancastrian system to make indigenous schools more efficient. So he knows that there is a difference between these two. So he actually recommends the government to introduce Lancastrian system so that the indigenous vernacular schools will become more efficient. Now, if we go back a little bit, the earliest information we have on the indigenous schools, I'm trying to take as many examples from Madras Presidency because Andrew Bell was in Madras. So I'm trying to get as many examples as possible from there. So Ziegenbalg was the earliest person who has written about the indigenous Tamil schools because he himself joined the school. He came in 1706, early part of 18th century. And he joined the Tamil school and he traced alphabet along with other, Tamil children on the sand. And, in 2 or 3 years time, he mastered enough Tamil to translate parts of Bible into Tamil. And during the course of his stay until 1719, he visited a number of indigenous schools to preach Christianity, but nowhere he has mentioned the presence of monitorial system or anything resembling that. Another example we can find is Alexander Johnston's example. Alexander Johnston was born in Scotland and he was brought to India at a very early age. And he went to a indigenous Tamil vernacular school in Madras and he studied there, and then he was sent for higher education in 1792. And he came back in 1802 and he worked in South India and Sri Lanka between 1802 to 1890 as a judge. And, Johnston studied in a Tamil indigenous school just 3 miles away from Egmore, where Andrew Bell was experimenting. So he doesn't mention that. In fact, his letter written to Charles Grant on 23rd July 1833, he has written extensively about the intimate ceremonies that parents performed, before sending children to school, or even when these children start writing. It is something that he knew. He had seen his friends, his classmates, undergoing that. So that minute detail he gives, but then there's no mention of the monitorial system. Now, there was government effort, particularly from England, to pressurize the government of India to adopt. After the British Parliament earmarked 100,000 rupees, a court of directors wrote the next year saying that the money should be spent on Lancastrian schools. They are there from time immemorial. Hastings could not find any evidence. Hastings was the Governor General at that time. But he promised the court of directors that he would establish 2 experimental schools in every district. But when the first education department, called General Committee of Public Instruction, was appointed, they collected the data on the existing native schools, the indigenous schools. But there is no mention of this, the experimental schools, why they were not established, or what actually happened to this proposal, we do not have. But during the same time, Wazir of Ajmer is a town on the northwestern part of India. And Wazir was one of the very rich person there. He handed over a considerable sum. I could not actually identify or find out what the actual sum was. So the later reports say, and then letters say that he handed over large sums of money to Governor General Hastings to establish a modern educational institution, because he had already heard the Hindu college that was established in Bengal. So he wanted a similar institution. Hastings sent Jabez Carey, son of Baptist missionary William Carey, to establish a Lancaster school. People were very unhappy, and they virtually chased Jabez Carey back to British territories. That was still, to Bengal. Sorry. So Trevelyan, commenting on this, reported, if ever there was a case to which the asking for bread and giving a stone is applicable, it's our education policy. So essentially, Indians did not want that particular system when the government was trying to force. But then there was hardly any force. There was an experimental thing that was done just like Ajmer, and nothing actually happened. Once again, in 1852, Charles Wood introduced pupil teacher system, recommended pupil teacher system, and the government of India replied, pupil teacher is inapplicable to India, but we still wish that a trial should be made, and nothing is heard of that. Most of the time, it remained a missionary project, establishment of Lancaster schools or Bell's Monitorial system. Mostly it was a missionaries. A number of missionaries started introducing in 1810s and 1820s. Particularly London Missionary Society and Baptist missionaries trained Pandit supervisors, what they call Pandit supervisors, and a number of schools were established. In fact, Robert May, he was from a London Missionary Society. He established 36 schools in Chinsura, and Chinsura is a district in Bengal, and these schools were very popular. And these were regular schools; these were not monitorial schools. But he died in 1818, and after that, I.D. Pearson succeeded him to the London Missionary Society, to his position. He adopted monitorial system. During the next 7-8 years, almost all the schools came down except one school, which was in Chinsura town, because that school was, most of the children in that school was, were from the, Eurasian community, the mixed, children of mixed background, like European fathers and Indian mothers. Only those poor children, poor Europeans and poor Eurasians children were, admitted in those schools, in that school. So only it stayed there. Pearson went ahead and actually translated Bell's instruction into Bengali called Patashalar Viboran, but still it did not become popular. So even the missionaries abandoned the experiment by 1830. Now, what happened to these indigenous schools under colonial state? There were two things that the colonial state was very impressed with it. First was the quality of education, and secondly, the cost effectiveness. So even somebody like H.S. Reed, who was very dismissive of these schools, admitted that the students who had completed their education in indigenous vernacular schools, when they joined high school, they could master cube root, 4 books of Euclid and algebra up to division within a year, and answer difficult questions with astonishing rapidity. So even the most well-known critics also admitted the quality of education was very good. By 1840, the Orientalists had lost out. They could no longer hold, because Macaulay had attacked them, in a very severe language. He had attacked them, and also they lost their power, and one by one started retiring and then returning back to England, and hardly a couple of them remained, like H.S. Reed in North India, and George Jervis, not Thomas Best Jervis, his older brother George Jervis, in Western India. But then except a couple of them, rest of them were not there. So it was then the government started thinking in terms of mass education. So they argued that a national system of education for the entire country can be built on the foundation of indigenous education. So they started adopting the indigenous schools, and then they first introduced geography. Geography was the first modern subject to be introduced into the primary schools, the Indian indigenous schools. So they supplied maps, globes, blackboards, printed books for the students. They gave 1 month teacher training on how to maintain attendance, register, prepare quarterly and annual reports, use maps and globes to teach geography. After adoption, the government continued the indigenous curriculum. In many places, it continued the textbooks to teach vernacular. Same textbooks based on Ramayana and Mahabharata was continued in the government primary schools. Now they were called government primary schools, so they also continued it. But one difference was that earlier in the indigenous schools, only the master had a handwritten manuscript. Now the government printed, or rather there were a number of missionaries who had established printing presses. Government got used the missionary printing presses to print school textbooks. And many a time the missionaries themselves had printed many books, particularly geography book was printed by Calcutta School Book Society that was used across Bengal and as well as in Bihar. So, now the books came to be in the hands of students as well. The printed books came to be in the hands of students as well. So it also continued Amarakosha in many schools and Hitopadisha, and this curriculum continued well into the late 19th century, almost 50, 60 years, the same kind of curriculum continues. The teachers were given 5 rupees a month as a salary, and annual examination was conducted by educational inspectors. Now, only Punjab and Bombay Presidency had new government schools established by the colonial state, or rather the provincial governments. Punjab, because the British introduced Urdu as a medium of instruction, and Punjabi teaching indigenous teachers did not know the language or the script. So the new schools were established. In Bombay, Elphinstone, the Orientalists wanted to appoint only landed Brahmins, not even poor Brahmins as teachers. So new schools were established there. Secondly, it was cost effective. In fact, more than the quality of education, it was the cost which made the colonial state to adopt these schools. Macaulay had fixed the salary of Indian teachers at 30 rupees a month. And government was unwilling to give that amount, because if the government establishes new schools, they also had to build new buildings and also the infrastructure and give teacher 30 rupees. If they adopt the schools, the indigenous schools, over a period of time, the government gave buildings, but not at one go. By the end of 19th century, by 1870s, most of the schools started having, regular buildings, school buildings, whether it is in rural area or in urban area. But then immediately when they started adopting the schools in 1840s, they just could give 5 rupees and some teaching aid to the schools, and then the schools would run. So the colonial state divided the indigenous schools into 4 categories. First one was stipendary pathshalas, or the government primary schools, where a small salary of 5 rupees was given and a small pension to those who completed 20 years of service. Now, second one was the rewarded pathshalas, where the teachers were already getting more than 5 rupees. They said that we do not want your salary, but give us teaching aid, like blackboards, maps, and globes. And most of the schools which opted for rewarded pathshalas were from the remote areas where they could not have access to, the printed books and blackboards and globes and so on. The third category was registered pathshalas. These were the pathshalas. These schools were already, well enough. They had a, better income and then better access to the, towns. These were mostly the schools which were situated in towns where they had access to printed books and, other teaching aids. Government gave them 1 rupee for submitting the data, because, all they had to do was by the end of the year, they had to give the data, how many students are there, how many had passed, and what were the books that were used in the school, and the basic data. Because this data was necessary, the data had to be submitted to the British Parliament time and again, because a single MP could stand up in the Parliament and ask what was being done. in India regarding education, the Secretary of State would write to the Governor General, and Governor General would write to the concerned, the directors of public instruction, governors and directors of public instruction, and they had to supply the data. So this way, the cheapest way of getting the data was possible. Then the fourth category were pure indigenous schools, which had no connection with the government. Again, the reason was that they already had sufficient income and then they could survive on their own. They did not want any government aid or support. In 1881-82, Indian Education Commission was set up, and W.W. Hunter was the chairman of the commission. So it has been popularly known as Hunter Commission. It first time in India, it collated the data for the entire British India. So we find here 84,740 primary schools with 200 with more than 2 million children. Of that, only 5,360 schools had been established by the British, which had 312,000 plus children. So remaining 79,380 government primary schools was generally indigenous schools adopted by the government, and they had more than 1.84 million children. So the largest number of schools adopted by the government was in Bengal. It had adopted 48,834 indigenous schools. Hunter recommended that government should give grant to all indigenous schools, whether they are, following the government, prescribe government books, or is it with the government, or they are independent. That government should give grants to everyone. So during 1881-82, these were pure indigenous schools, and they were spread across different provinces. On we have around 17,557 schools with 345,482 students, and on an average of 19.67 students per school. So we see continuity in this. After the government took over the schools, if we try to collect the data in the archives, I know they are recorded under circle schools or Halkabandi schools, because initially when the government adopted the school, it adopted one school in a circle of 5 villages. That was the first set of schools that were adopted. So they were called circle schools. In Hindi, they are called Halkabandi school. Halk also means a circle. Then they were called village schools in certain areas, and they were called Patshalas up to 1860. In 1860, from 1860 onwards, the government introduced 1% cess, education cess. That is 1% over and above the land tax paid by the landholders. Like, for example, if they are paying 100 rupees, then they had to pay 1 rupee extra, 101 rupee, which was education cess. So from 1860 to 1885, these schools came to be known as cess schools. Hunter Commission recommended handing over of all educational institutions into Indian hands, but many Indians opposed it because they could not manage high schools and colleges, because high school headmasters were British headmasters, trained headmasters in England, and they could not individually get them. So they wanted the government to continue to control the high schools and colleges, but most of the primary schools were handed over to Indian hands in the form of to the municipalities and district boards, which had elected Indians as the majority people there. So but then government did not stop that. They still forced these municipalities and district boards to handle high schools and colleges, though the Indians were opposing it and protesting against that. But it happened in a slower phase than one time handing over of all the primary schools. That happened between 85 to 87, 88. Within 2-3 years, all these primary schools were handed over. From 1950 onwards, these are called government schools, government primary schools. So there is an unbroken connection between the indigenous vernacular schools, colonial primary schools, and post-colonial schools. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much indeed, Parimala. Absolutely wonderful.